Men used to sacrifice without question. Time, money, energy, freedom. The entire architecture of a man's life, his ambitions, his independence, his personal direction, bent and reorganized around the project of providing for and maintaining a relationship. Without negotiation, without calculation, without asking whether the structure he was sacrificing for was going to hold. That was the deal. You found someone, you committed, you gave what was required, and you did not sit around analyzing whether the return justified the investment, because that was not how the conversation was framed. Sacrifice was not an option, it was an expectation. It was what men did. And now something has shifted, not dramatically, not with a manifesto or a movement or a public declaration, quietly. In the same way that most meaningful behavioral shifts happen, through millions of individual calculations, each made privately, each arriving at a similar conclusion, that the blind sacrifice model, the give everything and trust the structure will hold version of commitment, no longer makes the sense it once appeared to make. And the easy response to that shift is to call it selfishness, to say that men became less willing to give, less capable of putting someone else first, less mature in their understanding of what real love requires. That is the comfortable narrative. It is also almost entirely wrong. Here is what actually changed. The return on sacrifice changed. The structure that sacrifice was supposed to build toward changed. The information available to men about what sacrifice reliably produces changed. And when those things change, behavior follows. Not because the men involved stopped caring, but because sacrifice, when examined honestly, is not a feeling. It is an investment decision. And investment decisions respond to evidence. Today, you are going to understand exactly what shifted beneath the surface. The incentive architecture, the risk calculation, the autonomy equation, the question of reciprocity, and what happens when it breaks down. And the honest distinction between men who are making strategic decisions about when and where to invest their sacrifice, and men who are using a valid structural critique to avoid the personal growth they know they need. Before anything else, you need to understand the foundation. Because people sacrifice when specific conditions are in place. And when those conditions weaken, sacrifice declines. Not because people become worse, because the inputs to the decision change. People sacrifice when the reward is predictable, when they can look at what they are giving up and have a reasonable confidence that the investment will compound into something they actually want, a stable partnership, a family, a shared life built on mutual investment and genuine loyalty. When that predictability exists, sacrifice feels rational. It feels like planting a seed in reliable soil. People sacrifice when loyalty is reciprocal, when the giving goes both directions, when their investment is matched, not identically, not in the same currency, but in kind, when the person they are sacrificing for is also sacrificing something real for them, when the dynamic is genuinely mutual rather than one party continuously investing while the other party continuously receives. People sacrifice when the structure is stable, when the legal, social, and relational architecture that their sacrifice is building toward is solid enough to justify the investment. When the thing they are giving up their autonomy and independence and personal direction to build has a reasonable chance of lasting. The binary worth understanding here is the distance between romantic idealism and strategic realism. Romantic idealism says sacrifice is its own reward, that love is sufficient justification for giving everything, that calculating the return on your investment is itself a failure of love. Strategic realism says that sacrifice is a form of investment, and investments have to make sense. That giving without structure does not produce love. It produces resentment. That the most sustainable sacrifice is the one made from a position of clear, mutual understanding rather than a position of blind hope. Sacrifice is an investment decision. When the conditions that make that investment rational weaken, the investment declines. That is not cynicism. That is just how human behavior works in every domain where cost and return are both real. To understand how the conditions changed, you need the evolutionary context. Because the male sacrifice model did not emerge randomly. It emerged from a specific set of incentive structures that organized male behavior across most of human history. Men sacrificed to protect lineage, to secure the family unit, to build status within a tribe that recognized and rewarded provision and protection. The sacrifice was real and often brutal, but the incentive structure around it was also real and relatively clear. You provided, your family was protected, your status in the community reflected your capability as a provider. The social architecture recognized and rewarded male sacrifice in legible, consistent ways. That architecture has changed substantially. Women's independent earning capacity has transformed the economic foundation of the traditional sacrifice model, which is, in itself, a genuinely positive development. But it also changes the incentive calculus. When a partnership was the primary mechanism through which women accessed economic security, the reciprocal value of male provision was structurally embedded in the relationship. When that is no longer the case, when both parties are economically independent, the terms of the exchange require renegotiation that the cultural conversation has not fully caught up with. The legal environment around relationship dissolution has introduced asymmetries that previous generations of men did not face at the same scale or with the same visibility. The social shifts around gender roles have produced genuine uncertainty about what sacrifice is expected, what it earns, and what happens to a man's position when the relationship ends. None of this means the sacrifice model was better in its historical form. Much of it was not, but it does mean that the incentive clarity that underpinned male sacrifice for most of human history has genuinely weakened. And when incentive clarity weakens, the behaviors that depended on it change. Risk awareness increased. This is one of the most significant shifts and one of the least discussed, honestly. A generation ago, the information available to any individual man about what committed relationships and marriage statistically produce was limited primarily to the examples immediately around him. His parents, his uncles, the couples in his neighborhood. A sample size of dozens, maybe. Now the information environment is completely different. Divorce statistics are not abstract. They are visible, discussed, analyzed, and illustrated through the lived experiences of men in every corner of the internet. The financial consequences of relationship dissolution for men in particular are documented in detail that previous generations simply did not have access to. The emotional volatility patterns that characterize certain relationship dynamics are named, categorized, and recognized by men who previously would have had no framework for what they were experiencing. This is not fear. This is information, and information changes decisions. When a man in a previous generation considered committing to a relationship, he was making a decision with limited data. He was operating on cultural programming, family example, and the assumption that if he worked hard and was a decent person, the structure would hold. That assumption was often incorrect, but he did not know that going in. at least not with the clarity that is now available. When a man in 2026 considers the same decision, he is making it with substantially more data. He knows the statistical landscape. He has seen the outcomes play out for men he knows personally. He has a much more detailed picture of the realistic worst-case scenario. And that picture is not reassuring. The binary between blind sacrifice and calculated commitment is not between love and the absence of love. It is between giving without information and giving with open eyes. And a generation of men who have been handed significantly more information than their fathers had are using it exactly the way any rational person uses information, to make more considered decisions. Something else shifted alongside the risk awareness, and it is more personal than structural. Modern men, more than previous generations, understand leverage. They understand what it means to enter a negotiation, any negotiation, from a position of strength versus a position of weakness. And they increasingly understand that romantic commitment, at least the version that requires maximum sacrifice before maximum trust has been established, is a negotiation in which they sometimes enter from a position of profound weakness. Attention asymmetry. The digital dating environment has made it visible that male attention, broadly speaking, is more abundantly supplied than female attention in the romantic marketplace. That the average man is competing in an environment where his investment of pursuit and initiation and early sacrifice is structurally expected while the reciprocal investment is not. That the leverage, at the early stages of most modern romantic dynamics, sits disproportionately with one party. Legal asymmetry. The outcomes of relationship dissolution are not symmetrically distributed. This is not a talking point. It is a legal and financial reality that more men understand more clearly than their fathers did. Sacrifice without leverage feels dangerous, not because men are unwilling to be vulnerable, but because vulnerability without any structural protection, vulnerability in a system that does not have clear mechanisms for mutual accountability, is not courage. It is exposure. And the men who have thought clearly about this are distinguishing between the two. The rule that emerges from this understanding is uncomfortable but coherent. Never sacrifice from a position of weakness, not because sacrifice is wrong, but because sacrifice made from desperation, from fear of losing the relationship, from a position where the other party holds all the leverage, does not produce the outcome sacrifice is supposed to produce. It produces a dynamic where the sacrifice is absorbed, the expectations recalibrate upward, and the man finds himself investing more and more into a position that is becoming less and less his. There is a third dimension that gets almost no airtime in these conversations, and it is one of the most important. Single life, for men who have actually engaged with it seriously rather than enduring it as a waiting room, has become genuinely competitive with partnership as a quality of life proposition. Financial control. The clarity of knowing exactly where every dollar goes. The ability to make financial decisions based entirely on your own priorities and values without negotiating every significant choice. The compounding effect of years of disciplined solo financial management that builds optionality in a way that shared finances, particularly in relationships with misaligned financial values, often cannot. Schedule control, the specific freedom of a life that goes exactly where you direct it. No guilt about how you spend a Saturday. No navigating another person's social obligations. No subtle pressure to be somewhere you do not want to be with people who do not interest you because the relationship requires it. Emotional quiet, the baseline stability of a nervous system that is not chronically activated by another person's variable emotional state. The experience of waking up and knowing roughly how the day is going to feel because its emotional climate is under your own management. These are not small things. And once a man has experienced them for long enough, once his nervous system has calibrated to genuine peace as a baseline rather than as an occasional break from relational turbulence, that peace becomes a real competitor to partnership. Not an insurmountable competitor, but a genuine one. And it changes the question. The question is no longer simply, do I want a relationship? Almost everyone wants connection at some level. The question becomes, is this specific relationship with this specific person offering something so genuinely valuable that it justifies surrendering what I currently have? That is a higher bar than the previous generation was applying, and it is producing a different set of answers. Here is the part of the conversation that requires the most honesty. The part where the structural analysis has to make room for the personal dimension. Men will sacrifice. They will sacrifice enormously, with extraordinary consistency and genuine depth, when the conditions that make sacrifice feel rational are actually present. Respect, not performance of respect. Genuine recognition that the man's contribution matters, that his effort is seen, that his presence adds something real to the life of the person he is investing in. Respect is not a luxury in this equation. It is the foundation. Without it, sacrifice does not feel like love. It feels like labor that is taken for granted. And labor that is taken for granted produces not deeper commitment, but slow, grinding resentment. Loyalty, the confidence that the investment is going into something stable, that the person receiving the sacrifice is also committed to the structure, that the reciprocal investment is real, even when imperfect, even when expressed differently. Appreciation, not constant verbal affirmation. The lived experience of a partner who notices, who acknowledges, who makes it clear through their behavior that what you bring to this partnership matters to them. Remove these things and sacrifice collapses, not because men become suddenly selfish, because the human investment instinct, which is what sacrifice actually is, does not function in a vacuum. It requires feedback. It requires the signal that the investment is landing somewhere that values it. When that signal is absent, the investment redirects to somewhere it will be valued, which might be work, which might be fitness, which might be male friendships, which might be solitude. The binary at the heart of this is reciprocity versus entitlement. When sacrifice operates within a framework of genuine reciprocity, where both parties are investing, where both parties are adjusting and accommodating and making the other person's well-being a genuine priority, it is sustainable indefinitely. When sacrifice operates within a framework where one party's investment is treated as a baseline expectation while the other party's contribution is treated as optional or contingent, it is not sustainable. And increasingly, men know that, and they are acting accordingly. There is a dimension to this that requires the hardest truth in this entire conversation. Because not everything that looks like strategic refusal to sacrifice is strategic. Some of it is immaturity with a philosophical justification layered on top. There are men who are using a valid structural critique as a reason to avoid the personal growth that genuine partnership requires. Men who frame their unwillingness to compromise as leverage protection when it is actually an unwillingness to be uncomfortable. Men who call their emotional unavailability strategic detachment when it is actually an unresolved fear of vulnerability. Men who point to incentive structures and legal asymmetries and attention economics as explanations for withdrawal that is fundamentally about the fact that they have not done the personal work required to be a good partner. lack of discipline, lack of purpose, lack of the kind of direction and mission that makes a man someone a person would want to build a life alongside. These are not structural problems, they are personal ones, and the men who have them are not refusing sacrifice for strategic reasons. They are avoiding sacrifice because sacrifice requires something of you. It requires showing up consistently. It requires putting someone else's needs alongside your own. It requires the vulnerability of genuine investment in an outcome you cannot fully control. That is hard. And using structural critique as cover for not doing it is a form of self deception that eventually produces exactly the isolation and purposelessness it was supposed to protect against. The distinction matters. Strategic refusal is a man who has done the work, who has built something real, who has genuine options and genuine standards, and who is therefore in a position to be selective about where and when and how he invests his sacrifice. Immaturity is a man who has not done the work and is rationalizing that fact with borrowed structural arguments. Both exist. And honest self-assessment is the only tool that distinguishes between them. Let's slow down for a moment, because underneath all of the strategy and calculation, there is something worth naming carefully. Love does not feel like a transaction. When it is real, it does not feel like cost-benefit analysis. It feels like something you want to give. Like sacrifice, that does not register as sacrifice because it is oriented towards someone whose well-being genuinely matters to you. But partnership operates on structure, and structure is what allows love to survive contact with reality. The daily friction of two lives trying to coexist, the financial stress, the disagreements about direction, the moments where the romantic feeling is absent, and what remains is either a framework of mutual respect and commitment or nothing at all. Sacrifice without structure creates resentment, not because the person sacrificing stopped loving, but because love without structure asks everything of the feeling and nothing of the architecture. And feelings are variable. They ebb and flow. They are affected by stress and exhaustion and life events. The relationships that survive those fluctuations are not the ones held together by the intensity of feeling alone. They are the ones where the structure, the mutual respect, the shared vision, the clear understanding of what each person is investing and what each person needs is solid enough to carry the relationship through the times when the feeling needs support. The other thing worth distinguishing is peace versus passion. There was a period where high drama in a relationship felt like evidence of depth, where volatility was interpreted as intensity, where the emotional turbulence of a difficult relationship felt more real, more alive, than the quiet of something stable. That calculus is changing. Men who have experienced genuine sustained peace, whose nervous systems know what genuine emotional stability feels like, are no longer interpreting chaos as passion. They are interpreting it as cost, and they are choosing stability in a way that previous generations, for whom the alternative to a turbulent relationship was an equally turbulent solo life, were often not positioned to do. So when does sacrifice actually make sense? What are the conditions that make investment rational? Clear, mutual respect. Not promised, demonstrated. Over time, through behavior that is consistent even when it is inconvenient. You know, respect is real when it shows up on the hard days, not just the easy ones. Balanced effort, not identical effort. Balanced effort. Both people are genuinely invested in the quality of what they're building. Both people are making adjustments. Both people are carrying real weight, shared vision. Not perfect alignment on every preference, genuine agreement on the direction, on what the partnership is for, on what you are both sacrificing toward. Without shared vision, sacrifice has no target. It is just loss, conflict, maturity, the ability to navigate disagreement without it becoming destabilizing, without weapons being deployed, without the relationship itself being held hostage to every difficult conversation. Conflict maturity is one of the rarest and most undervalued qualities in a partner, and its absence is one of the fastest ways to make sacrifice feel unsustainable. Financial transparency, open, honest, adult conversation about money, about what each person brings, what each person expects, and how shared financial decisions will be made. Financial opacity in a partnership is not a small issue. It is a structural vulnerability that compounds over time. When these conditions are genuinely present, sacrifice is not a risk. It is an investment in something that will return more than it costs. It amplifies your life rather than shrinking it. It produces a partnership that makes both people more capable, more grounded, more purposeful than they would be alone. The key is that these conditions must be demonstrated, not assumed, not hoped for, not promised in the early romantic phase when everything feels possible, demonstrated through consistent behavior over sufficient time. And how do you maintain yourself within a relationship once you have entered one? Because sacrifice from strength requires that the strength is maintained, that entering a partnership does not mean dismantling the foundation that made you someone worth partnering with. Keep building your mission. The work that gives your life direction and meaning does not become less important because you are in a relationship. In fact, it becomes more important. A man without mission in a relationship becomes a man whose entire identity is the relationship, and that is not healthy for him or for the partnership. Maintain your male friendships, the brotherhood that challenges you, that holds you accountable, that exists independently of your romantic life. These relationships are not competition for your partner's attention. They are structural support for your own psychological health. Their absence is felt in ways that eventually affect the relationship itself. Protect your financial literacy. Know what you have. Know what you are building toward. Make financial decisions as a conscious adult rather than deferring everything to the relationship dynamic. Financial clarity is not a lack of trust. It is a form of self-respect. Stay physically disciplined. The physical practice that you built during your solo years, the commitment to fitness that produces the embodied confidence, and the physical health that you carry into every area of your life. That practice does not belong to your single life. It belongs to you. Maintain it. Avoid emotional overinvestment in the early stages. Let trust build at the pace that evidence justifies, not faster. Because overinvestment early, driven by hope rather than demonstrated reality, is what produces the dynamic where sacrifice precedes respect. And sacrifice that precedes respect rarely earns it. The rule is direct. Sacrifice from strength, not fear. From a position of genuine options, genuine standards, and genuine self-respect. Not from the desperate need to hold onto something before you have assessed whether it is worth holding. Here is where we land. Men have not stopped caring. They have started calculating. And those are not the same thing. The calculation is not heartless. It is not a rejection of love or depth or genuine partnership. It is the recognition that sacrifice is an investment, that investments require conditions, that giving everything blindly into a structure that has not demonstrated it can hold is not nobility. It is exposure. And a generation of men who have more information about what that exposure produces than any previous generation is making different decisions with that information. You have two options. You can sacrifice blindly and hope. You can enter relationships on the assumption that your willingness to give will be met with equivalent reciprocity. You can trust the feeling in the early stages as sufficient evidence of what the whole structure will produce. You can repeat the patterns that the men before you repeated and discover, the hard way, whether the structure holds. Or you can sacrifice strategically. You can build first, develop the leverage, the discipline, the mission, the financial clarity, the physical presence that makes you someone whose sacrifice means something because it comes from genuine abundance rather than desperate need. You can vet the conditions honestly before you invest fully. You can look for demonstrated respect, genuine reciprocity, shared vision, conflict maturity, and financial transparency. And when those things are genuinely present, you can give everything, fully, without reservation. Because sacrifice in that context is not a risk, it is a return. Men haven't stopped caring. They've started calculating. Build leverage first. Vet alignment honestly. Sacrifice only where the structure genuinely supports it. Strength first, sacrifice second.